Hemispheres is a bit of a curious Rush album. It's the last one that we got from the band in the 1970s, their proggiest years in the eyes of many. This is a disc that definitely takes after albums such as A Farewell to Kings and completes an important story arc, the Cygnus story arc with Cygnus X1, Book 2, Hemispheres, which is the very first track that is on this affair, which is one that has only 4 total songs on it, with the Cygnus cycle taking up all of Part A on your vinyl record and spanning nearly, well, actually a little bit over 18 minutes. There's also a secondary epic on this album, one that spans close to 10 minutes, which is the very final track, track number 4, La Villa Strangulato, which is or just simply an exercise in self-indulgence, which is an instrumental. It's a 12-part suite, so to speak, and it's one that occurred to Alex Lifeson in a dream. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about this disc. Let's first off talk about its center point, which is Cygnus X1 Book 2. One that is able to sort of put to rest this cycle. It's one that became the basic point for Hemisphere, the basis point, should I say, and it sort of just ties everything together. It's a very nicely done song, one that at times can feel a little bit off. It's one that has a very large and poignant stop right in the middle of it before kicking back in. This is also a multi-track epic, 6 parts in all. Now, within the 18 minutes, you're getting a very wide and vast story about Apollo, the bringer of wisdom, about Dionysus, the bringer of love, Armageddon, which is the battle of the heart and the mind, Cygnus, which is the bringer of balance, that is his role, and then the sphere, which is a kind of dream, and the interloping storytelling that takes on a life of its own during this track is really one of its highlight points, as well as the constructive way in which this has been really put together. There's one thing that Rush was very good at doing in the 1970s, albeit to sometimes an overindulgent state, is always keeping you very engaged and interested in what they're doing based off of one side of their sound really purveying over the other in times where you might be getting a little bit lost. So if it's the music that seems to be awe-inspiring and the part that really you're focused on, maybe the lyricism will seem a little far-fetched, either that or a little bit cheesy. Either that or the strength of the storytelling can sometimes get beyond some of the more basic elements of the construction, but whenever you combine the two together, it makes for a great experience. It makes for 18 minutes that pass by very, very quickly. This is an epic that's well respected by this band, and should be. It's not up there in the pantheon with 2112 in the eyes of many, considering that's the popular album, aside from Moving Pictures, but it's still one that holds its own weight and does so very well and fulfills the cycle of the Cygnus X1 idea and finishes it very nicely. Now, Circumstances in the Trees are a duo of songs that are quite interesting, and this is something that's pretty standard for Rush albums of this time. Circumstances feels like it's the weakest on the album, whereas The Trees starts off a little bit slower and actually operates as a bit of a calming point before exploding into a nicer finale in its final few minutes. Really enjoyed The Trees. I think it's an underrated song by this band. It has a lot of potency and a lot of power. But moving into the instrumental finale, this is the first time Rush had penned something that was purely instrumental, although a lot of their tracks before this have had a huge instrumental guideline, and one that really seems very focused on that side of their sound. Now, with this one, it's one that borrows some concepts and some ideas that may sound extremely familiar to those who watched Merry Melodies or any real cartoons that have sort of spanned up throughout the ages. And if you've only watched stuff like Family Guy, there's a good chance that maybe they've even used it and borrowed it. It's a fairly common theme. It's going to sound very familiar and jump right out at you. It's something that you hear bits and pieces, interpolations of twice within the song, to the point where the band actually gave the original songwriter some royalty money just to ensure that there would be no sort of legal ramifications later on down the line. Now remember, in the 1970s, this was not something that you saw as often, but in most cases it was because there was a sort of permission that was shared within either labels or within bands where you're not going to see people go after one another quite so deeply, but it still did happen. So Rush basically did this to dodge a bullet, and it was a wise choice, but even though nothing came to pass, it was still just a wise choice on their part to avoid any potential conflict. Now, this is one where the monster side of this, and you'll know just by reading the track listing what I mean, is really the portions that have the strength behind it, the oomph. The rest of it does actually feel exactly like this title suggests, as an exercise in self-indulgence. This was kind of a bit of a bold idea to end an album on a purely instrumental piece, though it is one that seems to, at its end, fulfill you in some ways. It's just the idea that it does get a little bit tedious at points, and I think that brings this album down a little bit, but it is also one that in its best moments, in its most powerful moments, has some of Rush's strongest material. That's kind of where the really weird clash of the Titans battle takes place in my mind about this song. It has really strong power and some of the best work, not only on Hemispheres, but like I said, during this first portion of their career. I mean, there's just some great riffs in here, and the boys just have been focused on this instrumental idea and knew they were going to have to drive this song completely and totally on their instruments alone and really dialed things up a little bit. If you thought that they were capable of some sincere and serious power on songs prior to this, this is one where you're going to see the true power that this band possesses. Overall, I think Hemispheres was an album that closed out the 1970s with some fans of Rush being very satisfied, whereas others were maybe just a little bit unsatisfied, kind of left on a teetering note. I do think that many fans found the closing of the Cygnus X1 idea to be a really pleasing endeavor, a great 19-minute epic, and it was going to be one that, unforeseen to them, they would have to learn to really respect and love, considering something of this dynamic variety, this length, this very huge and grandiose feel was not, again, going to really be a part of of what Rush was all about. There were going to be a couple of epics that followed, but nothing really to match this in as far as length was concerned. But either way, Hemispheres is another one of the 70s Rush releases that is either underrated in the eyes of a lot of fans that stick toward really the popular classics. Either that, or it's one that is perhaps given a little bit too much credit. There are some folks that I have seen that have sworn up and down that Hemispheres was the pinnacle of Rush's work, and while I disagree with that sentiment, I definitely can understand why they feel so strongly toward the disc, because it does have a lot of powerful, powerful moments. But now Rush enters into a brand new decade, the 1980s, which also means that Rush was going to give something new a try, something that was potentially going to be a way to extend their career, either that or was going to be the death knell of their career. But we'll see what happens whenever Permanent Waves is dropped, which is the next album here in the Rush discography. I hope you'll tune back in for that. Cover Killer Nation, I'll talk to you later.